Welcome to Eviliv, the live media commentary show that answers the question, do you have to be bit by a vampire to be turned into one? Subscribe if you're new to the channel because today we are reviewing Universal Pictures' The Last Voyage of the Demeter. Now, this is ostensibly just based on a chapter referenced as the captain's log from Bram Stoker's Dracula, the novel. And it was in development hell for like 2 years. I heard about it somewhere in between that 2-year period, and I was really excited. And then when Renfield came out, which is also a Universal Pictures film, I was afraid that that's what it turned into. And so I was really bummed. And as I actually really loved Nick Cage, I did not want to see him as Dracula, and I did not want to see that film turn into a comedy. Because Bram Stoker's Dracula is one of those novels that is sort of resonant and dark and terrifying and beautiful. Not a comedy at all, right? Ultimately, this film came out, and I was incredibly stoked to realize that I was wrong. So, that being said, this is directed by Andrei Ovredal, screenplay by Bragi Schutt Jr. and Zach Olkewicz. I don't know if I'm saying any of this right, and I apologize if I'm butchering your names. And it's I also want to sort of call out a couple other people in this because the cinematography of this is spectacular. I mean, the lighting, the framing, the just general look is beautiful. And it was Tom Stern who headed that up. And the music is another aspect of it. First of all, the soundtrack to this, if you are not familiar with it, you should check it out because it's genuinely amazing. But in the film, throughout the course of the film, as the score sort of elevates and flows and changes, it really, as with every great film score, informs you subconsciously how to feel about a given situation. And it's done really genuinely well. So the music was by Bear McCreary. This was released August 11th, and so the budget was $45 million, and in its first weekend, it has only received $6.5 million. And I think there's a number of different reasons for that. I think first and foremost, the fact that Universal Pictures released 2 Dracula movies very, very close together is really stupid decision on their part, because you're not just going to confuse or oversaturate your own audience. And 2, people expected something of this because I fundamentally don't think they came into this thinking of Bram Stoker's Dracula, the novel. They came into this thinking either Renfield or some sort of dark universe attempt to sort of like spur it or something. And while the end of this suffered because it suggested that, the entirety of the film does not direct it at all. Another thing that I think people really shit the bed on their reviews on this film because they fundamentally, again, did not understand this film, was that they were expecting a Dracula like we've seen in the past, where that character is the prime protagonist that takes the form of a debonair, sort of a silver fox type character that seduces women and, plays with men's emotions. That's not this Dracula at all. This Dracula is trying to get from his Transylvania home to London. That's the purpose of this Dracula. And as with anyone who has ever traveled long distances, and of course, I'm not talking by ship because that's weeks, but even if you're going to go overseas, flying, it's 12 hours. You can't just, that there's a finite amount of resources for you, drink and food. And you have to measure out that drink and food over the course of weeks as you travel by ship from point A to point B. Dracula's no different. He knows he has to go into this planning on slowly rationing his food, which are humans. And so he's not that debonair character sort of bantering with wit. He is a creature that is doing his best to only eat the bare minimum so that he has enough to last him for the entirety of the voyage. So when we're first exposed to Dracula, he is in his most sort of emaciated, monstrous form. And as he eats more and more throughout the course of this, he gains in his strength and he gains in his power and he gains in his ultimate view of the bat version of him. So for anyone who's familiar with Bram Stoker's Dracula, Dracula himself can turn into a bat, he can turn into a wolf, and he can take human form. He can also take a mist-like form. But in this particular film, in the construct of being on a ship and needing the crew to actually deliver him to London, he can't gorge on the remainder of the crew until the very, very end, where he's going to then ultimately take a mortal man's form. Another aspect of this that I think people sort of shit the bed on in their reviews is that they were expecting not only that debonair form of Dracula that we've seen so many times, but this is much more of that sort of, how do they describe it here? Count Orlok looking Dracula. Not, the Hammer horror Dracula, not the film Bram Stoker's Dracula that was released with Gary Oldman. This is not that version of Dracula. This is a creature. This is not a person. So it doesn't get into the history of how Dracula became Dracula. If you want to know anything about that, then you're going to have to read the novel, because again, this is just solely focused on the ship over from Transylvania to London. So he looks much more monstrous than people are expecting. And so that feeds into the horror aspect, which is the point of this film. It's a horror film, not a sort of Victorian drama that the film Bram Stoker's Dracula was. This is a horror film. And even the director himself, Andre Øvredal, describes this as basically Alien on a ship in 1897. So this is meant to be a pure horror, not a period drama piece. And understanding that going in is going to completely change your perspective on what to expect out of this film. So if you're watching any of the trailers of this, that tells you everything you need to know. This is, in fact, a horror film. Sorry, my mustache is getting in my mouth. So I just genuinely don't understand why the reviews are as they are for this film, because it makes no sense. If you just take it at face value, which ironically, there's regular moments throughout the course of this film where this same idea is displayed. For example, the crew's all sitting around talking about if they can get the shipment to London early, then they'll get a bonus. And they're talking about what they're going to do with their bonus. The main protagonist of this is played by Corey Hawkins. He is a doctor. He's a black man. That's important to the focus of the story. And I'll get into that in a second. But his character name is Clemens. And he says that he just wants to understand reality. He's not really worried about money. He wants to understand what life is about and why life is the way it is. And the captain, played by Liam Cunningham, Captain Elliot, is telling him that, look, there is no explanation. You just have to accept life as it is. The audience needs to accept this film as it is and not try to judge it on what it's not based on their preconceived notions. Judge it for what it is. And I think you're going to have a completely different perspective on it. So Viggo Mortensen was actually attached to this for 2 years, which I only can guess at the role he was playing. I would assume it was Clemens because that's the main character, but it may have been someone else. But in any case, I would have loved to see him. I love Viggo Mortensen as an actor. I think he's brilliant in everything he does, and I would have loved to see him in this. I think he would have brought a sort of gravitas to the film that I don't know if it didn't miss by not having him in it, but I think the film would have been enriched by having him in it. But c'est la vie. What can you do? So we're basically opening on this film where the gypsies are delivering Dracula's possessions, which just contains like 50 crates full of his home soil and his own feeding device. Like they brought a little baggie for him, a little food bag, a little lunch sack, if you will, in the form of a young woman whom I am trying to find, but for the life of me, I can't in my notes. Oh, here it is. Played by Aisling Francosi. Sorry, I know I messed that up. Her name is Anna. Anyway, she is one of the gypsies' daughters who, in a pact with Dracula to save them and, allow them to sort of exist rather than being food for him, they sacrifice one of their own to him as food. And then by doing that, he leaves them alone. Well, for the ship ride, they had to sacrifice one of their daughters, Anna, and she's discovered because of a sort of a massive sea, storm raging that sort of knocks the crate that she was buried in over, and she is discovered by Clemens. I want to talk about Clemens really quick before we continue, because it's a choice to have a black man in a position of authority in 1897. If we're being completely honest, most men and women of color were either in their own territory living their own lives, or they were removed from said territory and working as some form of servant/slave. I'm not saying it's fair. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying that's period appropriate. By giving a black man the title of doctor, having him be educated, and yes, they did. There were men and women who did go through all of those trials and tribulations. So it's not like it's unheard of. It's just incredibly rare. By choosing the main character to be a black man in this era, there are assumptions that go along with that, meaning how other characters are going to treat him. And I thought they approached it really, really well. People are suspicious of his capabilities simply because of the color of his skin, as they would have been. He shares his own sort of tormented background by he fought really, really hard to be able to be a doctor, and then no one would hire him because of the color of his skin, which again is time appropriate. So they could have gone in a direction that a lot of other films have gone, where they completely rewrite history and say, well, women could do anything that men could do in society, and men and women of color could do anything that any other, Anglo person could do in society, when that was not the case. Women didn't even have rights like they do today in the 17th century. And so pretending as if they did not only removes you from the believability of the era of the film you're trying to portray, while yes, it is our modern sensibility, it completely destroys the function of the narrative of that story's character, of that character's story arc in the film. And they didn't do that in this. And I'm very, very pleased that they didn't, because I think the film would have suffered even more for that. And I know a bunch of assholes out there would cry woke, and I'm sure they're going to cry woke just because there's a black man that's a doctor in this film. But I feel personally that, one, just crying woke is a shortcut to thinking. And two, trying to apply that term to any sort of action is fundamentally misunderstanding what the term actually means. Is just being aware of racial injustice. That's it. It's not action. And so it just shows the ignorance of the people using that term. But then third, he is shown as a black man in this era, as they would be treated. So this is not a Mary Sue character. This is someone who has earned their stripes and is suffering simply because of the color of their skin with the characters around them. And it's appropriate in this era, and they treated it that way, and I appreciate that. Okay, so that being said, Clemens insists on not throwing this stowaway overboard, which is what you would typically do with a stowaway. And so he has to cut his rations in half in order to feed her. She is completely emaciated and drained of blood and has some sort of infection. And so he gives her a blood transfusion over and over again to sort of put her back to normal, some semblance of normalcy. And what ultimately that's doing is delaying the inevitable. So in this version of the tale, if you're bit by Dracula and you survive, then you will inevitably turn into a vampire. You don't have to do that whole they bite you and then you have to bite them and drink their blood type thing. I'm not even sure where that came from, to be quite honest. But I'm glad that they sort of are owning the mythology in this film for the purpose of this film and having it be direct like that. It also creates this sense of horror because, yeah, you survived, But now, if you survived, is it because Dracula wanted you to survive or because he didn't want to be caught feeding by everyone else? But the ultimate repercussion is, yes, you're alive, but you're not going to be for very long. You are going to not only be a slave to his will, as he's going to be able to see through your eyes and your ears and hear through your senses and stuff and control you, but you're ultimately going to turn into a vampire, thus being susceptible to all of the foibles a vampire is susceptible. And in this particular film, sunlight is the prime way of murdering them as they burst into flame, which I love. I mean, visually, it's stunning to watch, and it's a great way of watching a vampire eat it. So he's delaying her turn by giving her a blood transfusion, but it does not solve the ultimate virus of vampirism that she is going to fall victim to at the very end of the film. And so what we see on this is a slow deterioration of confidence of all the ship crew members as the people go missing, blood stains are lying around, when they find corpses and when all their animals are consumed. Panic and horror starts ensuing and spreading across the entirety of all of the crew and the ship as a whole. And seeing those glimpses just peppered in of Dracula in his emaciated form, literally crawling in cases around the ship, and then ultimately in his empowered bat form of swooping through the fog and taking people out like a goddamn boss, is badass. It is brilliant, and I loved watching it. And again, the score and the cinematography and the acting all feed into what is a genuinely good horror film. Again, I don't understand why people didn't like this film. It has to be their expectations because it was crafted beautifully. Okay, so ultimately, if you've ever read the novel, you know there cannot be any survivors. They all have to eat it in the end. And that's where I think this particular telling of the story suffers, because there are two survivors. Of course, Dracula is the sole survivor. He has to then meet up and get his estate and terrorize all the people in London. But in this version, yes, he does escape like that, but so does Clemens. And Clemens becomes this almost, I'm like blanking on the name of the Dutch investigator / doctor that helps them in the actual novel. Anyway, it's going to come to me. But he a Van Helsing character. He turns into a Van Helsing character where he's hunting at the very, very end of this, Dracula. And I didn't like that at all. Like, if you're going to be so faithful to the story that was presented, extrapolating as you have to in order to make a feature film, because it's only, a chapter, then be true to it. But by changing it, that's where I think you lose a lot of the audience and critics. And you also lose the genuine fans of Bram Stoker's Dracula, the novel. This would be an infinitely more powerful film if Clemens eats it in the end. It would have been true to the novel and a true horror film. And let's just be honest, Clemens is not the Ripley character to survive at the end. I understand the director was going for an alien vibe, but you don't need a survivor in this particular case because you're not dealing with an alien and you're not dealing with a franchise that exists. You're dealing with desperate horror and failure to stand up to this supernatural being. And let's also realize what Dracula is. He is a mortal who made a pact with forces of darkness in order to have immortality for one reason or another, depending on the retelling of the story. His humanity starts disappearing the longer he remains a vampire. The more he feeds on humans, the less humanity he has. We're all survivalist monstrosities, right? Our lizard brains, our tribal nature is to survive. If we have to eat people, we will eat them. And we see this in people who are trying to survive in winter when they're abandoned either in mountains in California or in some sort of northern glacier area. I mean, we've seen it over and over again. People will consume other human flesh in order to survive in appropriate situations. So a vampire is the exact same way. It is a human who is doing what they have to in order to survive after having made that pact with those forces of darkness. Ultimately, his humanity is stripped away, but he is still a creature, a one-time mortal turned immortal. So when you see this dark entity that is the vampire coming out and feeding on them, we have to always remember in the back of our mind, he is behaving in ways that are reminiscent of one who has lost their humanity, not in a force of darkness itself, which was never mortal. And a lot of the complaints I see about this are people saying, well, he's not really that force of darkness because he smiles or he repeats back lines that these other characters give him, their terror in order to heighten that sense of terror. No, that's intentional because he was once human and he's feeding on their terror as much as he's feeding on their blood. And that's what's beautiful about it. Would you recommend this for a horror newbie? Hey, Chris, how you doing, man? Yeah. I think it's a great film, personally. It is one of those that is period specific. So if you don't like period pieces, then you probably won't enjoy it. But if you like horror and you like period pieces, I think you're going to dig this. And this is one of those OG tales, But you have to understand what Dracula is going into it. Because it's not that sort of comic Count Dracula or Count Chocula that everyone sort of imagines in their head. He is a monster trying to survive in the absence of his humanity. Trying to ration out his food in order to get to London, on this ship. And he's reliant on them to get him there. So he can't just kill them all. He has to just slowly feed on them a little bit at a time, keeping his strength until the very end when he can just gorge. Because he can't have witnesses, of course. The other side of this is that he reminded me of the vampire approach of 31 Days of Night, if anyone's ever seen that film, which is great. It's, of course, based on a comic series, which is also amazing. But 31 Days of Night vampires, their idea of religion and faith does not exist. Like, crosses don't do anything to these vampires. They're meaningless. You see them often in this film where there's, like a little child with a cross or someone like presents a cross to Dracula to try to turn him away. There are no gods. There is no good or evil. There is just survival. And it's men's weakness and need to understand the universe that created religion. And vampires don't need that. So why would they care if you showed a crucifix? That means nothing to them. And so to have that aspect of it played through, I think is really, really important. In 30 Days a Night, there's this great moment when one of the victims is staring at this eternal entity that is about to consume them, this vampire. And she's like, "Oh God, help! Oh God, no! Oh God, no!" And the vampire stops right in front of her. And he's like, "God?" And he looks up and he's like, "No, God." And it's the most powerful moment because you realize your last hope was that there was someone up there that cared about you, that would save you. These vampires wouldn't exist if there was. So how could you possibly think that that would save you? And for them to parrot that back, just feeding on your terror the whole time, is horrific. And I loved it in 31 Days a Night. I love it in this when these guys are like, "Oh God, no." And Dracula's just slowly climbing toward them. He's like, "Oh God, no." Just repeating, parroting back their most agonizing cries, the last ditch effort of any help at all. And he's just playing with them. Oh, it's beautiful. It's absolutely wonderful. I'm sure people don't like it, but whatever. No, no, it doesn't. So ultimately what we're getting here is the most horrific version of a Dracula. He doesn't need to turn into a wolf or rats or mist in this. He is in control of the entire crew at all time, even when they turn against him in an organized fashion. And they actually do like shoot him or bury an axe in his back. It doesn't matter. You can't do anything to this entity. It is immortal because of your blood. And as long as it can continue to feed, you have no hope at all. And that dread that sinks into you as a viewer and sinks into the crew that are trying their best to survive through this nightmare is the best that you can ask for in a horror film. And that's exactly what this is. This is a hardcore period horror film. This is not a drama. And people reviewing this have to understand that. I mean, they've given this a horrible review of 6.6 out of 10 on IMDb, which makes no sense to me, and 48% rotten on Rotten Tomatoes on the critics score. That doesn't make any sense at all. This is a beautiful film that is acted really well. It is written incredibly well. The score is amazing. The monster is genuinely monstrous. It checks every box about what the director wanted it to be, and people are judging it based on what they wanted versus what the director wanted. And that's just not fair. I will say the audience gave it 74%, which is a lot better. I would argue it's not better than that because of the very ending. So let's talk about this. This is a spoiler review, everyone. I've already ruined a lot of this, and I've already talked about this briefly. But if you want to go on this as a surprise, turn the video off. There, again, I've already said it once, but I'll say it again. Clement survives, and he turns out to be a Van Helsing character where he takes it upon himself to understand Dracula and hunt him down like Van Helsing does in the original novel, the Dutch Doctor. I didn't like that at all. I want all of the original characters to be there. And so when you are trying to retell an established novel and you're taking one chapter out and you're extrapolating it out into the length of a movie, just don't change it. Have the ending be the same as we know it's supposed to be. Because part of that is the horror of knowing that all these characters you're learning to love aren't going to make it. And that's terrifying for a viewer, especially because one of them is a little child. It's a little boy who you know is just adorable and inquisitive, and you just endear to him throughout the course of the film. And then finally, once Dracula gets him in his clutches, you're terrified. And the outcome of the vampire Dracula getting a hold of this kid is horrific. And it's just so sad and terrible. And it's beautiful because of that. And so having any survivors takes away from that horror. It takes away from that sense of impending dread and doom. Because someone lives. What the And so what are you going to do now? If this ever makes a sequel, which it won't because it did not make enough on its opening night to even cover a fraction of its development budget. But if there ever was to be a sequel, you would have to completely change the novel in order for it to make any sense at all. And that's not what people want when they go into a novel that is based around a chapter from the novel. You want the novel. And it blows my mind why they do that. They completely change something that's already existing. You're ruining it by doing that. 45 million is a lot, but when you look at the film, you understand where that went. It's not one of these $100 million type film. This is done with rain and storms on an actual set of a ship that feels large enough that you might be able to hide and stretch your legs around, and it really makes sense for the size of this ship, but it also feels wildly claustrophobic when it needs to. It's a perfect setting, and the way they filmed it and stuff, you understand that you have to have that form of a budget in order to sell it, because this is all practical. I'm sure they used, CGI and stuff for mist and storm backgrounds and stuff, but like everything looks and feels practical, from the monster to the set to the environment. And so that budget, I think, is very fair and conservative for what this film is intended to be. I think the reason why it only got 6.5 million in the box office, again, and this is why I'm going to sort of shit on every other reviewer that is shitting on this film, is because they didn't get what they wanted. They got what was intended. And if you go into this expecting what the director wanted, you're going to love this. If you go into this expecting the film Bram Stoker's Dracula or Renfield or some other version of Dracula that you happen to like, well, then you are going to be disappointed. This is more in line with what the film is, and the first unauthorized version via Nosferatu. It's great. It is really good. And that's why I gave it 4 out of 5 Evil Eyes. I would have given it 5 if it stuck the landing with the book. No survivors. But the fact that you had Clemens living, that ruins it for me. That just ruins it. I need the novel. If you're going to present every other aspect of this with the novel, stick the landing. And you didn't. But I got to tell you, there is so much good in this that you have to, if you love Dracula like I do, or any horror like I do, you have to watch this film because you will genuinely love it. Dracula's terrifying and he's a monster, but there's semblances of where his humanity once was and how he uses that to torture his victims. The crew is endearing. Even when they're being assholes, it's understandable why they're like that. And the actors do an amazing job selling their roles. That kid is just fantastic. Woody Norman. Kid actors are really hit and miss. I think Woody did a smashing job as Toby, the captain's grandson. Liam Cunningham did a great job as Captain Elliot. David Dastmalchian as Wolchek, the first mate who is going to end up inheriting the Demeter if it survives, is genuinely wonderful as the first mate. I'm not a huge fan of his as an actor, but he is great in this role. And Corey Hawkins as Clemens. Man, I had a hard time, again, because of the time period, and this is the 17th century, having a black man as an educated man and a doctor. That's a tough sell. But the way everyone around him reacted to him made it actually period appropriate, and so I bought into it. And I really think he did an amazing job in this. I would have preferred Viggo Mortensen, as he was once attached to it, but beggars can't be choosers. I'm a beggar, and I thought they did a great job. It was directed well. It was framed well. The music was great. The acting was great. It just fired on all cylinders, except for that ending. So, anyway, that's what I had. I hope you guys go watch this film. If you like horror, if you like Dracula, you gotta watch this film. We're not going to save it from getting a sequel. I don't want a sequel. I don't need a sequel. Not everything has to be a franchise beginner. You can just have a good horror film or a good drama and just have it exist without it having to lead to some other thing. This could have been perfect if that landing was stuck. And it's great, even with it. So check it out. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to my review of the The Last Voyage of the Demeter. This is a great film, and it's worth seeing in the theater because the scope of it. And you just got to love the theater horror experience. I missed it all throughout the pandemic. Now that I get to go back, it's wonderful. I loved it so much. As always, remember the evil spelled backwards live, so get your tookuses out there and be evil.